Chapter 5. The merry chirping of birds, usually a cheerful sound to regain consciousness to, ravaged Kessa's ears and split her aching head into fragments. Her eyes became painfully aware of sunlight beyond their lids. Vocally, Kessa wished for someone to hit her over the head again, just to stop the pain. Yeah, sorry about that. I had a sneaking suspicion you might try to run off and asked Rake to prevent that from happening. I didn't realize he'd take me so literally. Immediate recognition of the voice relaxed Kessa's fears, but did nothing to ease her discomfort. To the contrary, knowing who was in the room with her only increased it. If Kessa could have rolled her eyes, she would have. But instead she had to content herself with merely squinting at her captor. Your Rake is aptly named, she grated. He smiled impishly. Good to see your sense of humor hasn't been affected by your headache. I'm surprised it wasn't knocked out of me. Let me through now, or you'll regret it. A terrifying female voice boomed from the other side of the solid wood door. Kessa and her captor looked toward the door, partly expecting it to disintegrate into splinters with another command. Rake, it's all right. Let her in. I've been waiting for her. The door immediately swung open, admitting an incensed and disheveled Aquestria. Her dark hair, unbound and unbrushed, tumbled past her waist in luxurious but untidy waves, and her bodice was poorly fastened and slightly askew. Every inch of her proclaimed that she just jumped out of bed, taking little time to make herself presentable. Kessa, how dare you try and run away, after all I've done, she fumed. She'd awakened to find Kessa and the small bag of provisions they'd put together gone. Intuitively, she knew what her sister was up to, and when Mirabel gave her a message to meet Pantheus, the puzzle was complete. I will not tolerate your childish antics. You must learn. Equestria's tirade ceased suddenly, upon closer inspection of her sister's condition. You look ghastly. I was hit over the head with a rake. Kessa sat up very, very slowly, her head protesting every single movement. Pantheus set a watchdog on me. When I tried to escape last night, he whacked me over the head. Pantheus's eyebrows lifted, and his expression as good as admitted guilty as charged. Once Equestria's attention calibrated toward the Lord of Aquina, Kessa hoped she'd unleash her full wrath upon him, especially since Kessa's aching head prevented her from doing so. Good for him, Equestria declared, contradicting her sister's expectations. Pantheus barely concealed a smile, and Kessa, her face screwing up in displeasure, agony, and resignation, touched a hand gingerly to her brow. She was in too much pain to notice that her wounded hand had been treated and rewrapped. You got anything to eat? She managed. Pantheus rolled his eyes and led the girls to the great hall, where breakfast would be served. Even with a bump the size of a robin's egg on her head, Kessa tackled the porridge Mirabel brought her with the alacrity of a starved chipmunk. Pantheus watched her for a moment, his face depicting only a mild hint of disapproval, before quietly addressing her sister. How did you figure it out? How did you know about me and the Ashlanders? Simple observation. I thought I was being careful, and yet you picked up on it so quickly. Pantheus, as captain of the Auriet, it was my job to notice things people were trying to hide. I doubt your affiliation would be obvious to just anyone, Equestria explained, picking up her goblet and taking a drink of water. Elaborate, please. Glancing at Rake, who was sitting on a stool in the far corner of the room, working on something obscure, and regularly peering at Kessa with narrowed eyes, Equestria began. First, I found the type and number of questions you were asking about us suspicious. Second, you seemed very knowledgeable about what is going on for a man who's been confined for so long. Third, your fighting technique is exceptionally well tuned, which is not easily maintained locked inside castle grounds. True, you have a superb training facility, but your skill level is difficult to achieve or sustain without sparring with advanced opponents regularly. I added these facts to how vehemently you defended the Ashland outlaws. Behold, the recipe for your secret membership. What are you two whispering about so conspiratorially? The last of her porridge licked from her bowl, Kessa was now attuned to what was going on around her. Pantheus straightened in his chair, startled by her question. Rake stood up, drawing everyone's attention, mostly because of his massive size. The 6'5" hulk walked over to Kessa and wrapped a bandage around her head. Glancing up at him tentatively, she murmured her gratitude, unsure of what to do or say next. It's been soaked in herbs that will help your bump heal faster, and the smell will alleviate your headache, Rake clarified, then withdrew back to his stool. That's very kind of you, Kessa spoke with such heartfelt sincerity that after a fleeting look she blushed shyly and tried to look at anything other than him. Equestria folded her arms, and Pantheus's brow creased as they observed the exchange. Sliding his chair out noisily, Pantheus rose. Rake and I like to train after breakfast. Would you care to join us, Equestria? Her eyes lighting up with excitement, she responded with a definitive yes. Equestria hadn't trained for a while, and she was glad of the opportunity. I could do with some exercise, too. Kessa prepared to follow them toward the training yard. Turning to face her, Pantheus frowned. Kessa, you've been injured. Rest is the first thing you need, not exercise. You should go and lie down. You remember the way to your room, don't you? But Pantheus is absolutely right, Kess. Go and get some rest, Equestria ordered sternly, shutting out negotiation. Attempting to conceal her acute disappointment, Kessa obeyed. However, once the trio was out of sight, she pouted visibly all the way to her room. It was no easy task for her to settle down over the noise of swords clanging and the sounds of laughter and fun drifting into her bedroom window. In an effort to drown out the sound, she seized an extra pillow and slammed it down on her ear, immediately regretting the vehemence of her movement as her headache returned tenfold. Kessa rolled onto her back and stared at the canopy above. It was going to be a long day. Malleus drummed his fingers on the rough wood of the bar, ears perked for any relevant information he might overhear. You want another one? The Aquenian bartender asked. A large man, with a gruff beard and a face as gruff as his beard, the barkeep seemed the type that no one dare mess with. Thick, red tufts of hair hovered above his ears, but nowhere else on his head. He wore a beige tunic, accompanied by a heavily soiled apron and dark brown pants. A grubby towel, used for wiping up spills, was thrown casually over his shoulder like an accessory. His voice was rough and weathered, as if he'd boomed it over a rowdy crowd far too often. Malleus surmised that the man was not only a barkeeper, but the tavern owner as well. As such, it was likely a field of ripe, rarely harvested information. His tavern was relatively clean, considering the unkempt condition of its patrons, of which there were plenty. Some crowded noisily at the bar, and others crouched over tables in the shadowy corners of the room, their voices barely audible. Bracing both hands on the edge of the bar, the bartender leaned closer to Malleus and rumbled, "Did you hear me, man? You gonna have another drink or get out?" Malleus's eyes rose to meet the barkeeper's. There was a brief pause, and then the burly bartender backed off. "You ain't from around here, are ya? Welcome to Aquina. The name's Brom. Where you from?" he questioned, his voice much friendlier. "Everywhere," Malleus replied so quietly that the barman strained to hear him. "I have some questions of my own. You don't mind, do you, Brom?" The bartender glared at the stranger as his last few words scraped out like hard cheese on a dull grater. The bedroom door opened a crack as Equestria, her face red and damp from exertion, peeked into the room. Tentatively widening the crack just enough to squeeze through, she tiptoed over to the wash basin and almost leapt for joy when she found it was full of cool, clean water. Impressed that the castle staff not only had the foresight to refresh her wash basin, but also to lay out a fresh set of clothing, Equestria washed and changed as quietly as possible. Deftly wrapping her hair in a loose bun, Equestria glanced at her sister. Kessa was asleep, a book stretched across her chest and one dainty foot dangling off the edge of the bed. Beams of radiant light from the midday sun shone through the window, warming the room and swathing the bed in amber hues. Delicate rays of sunlight danced playfully with the highlights of Kessa's golden locks, avoiding her face as if by command. How like a sleeping princess she looked just then, omitting the head bandage, of course. Relieved she hadn't disturbed Kessa's rest, Equestria tread softly over to the door. Pantheus, preparing to knock, stood in the hallway. Having also bathed, he'd changed into a fresh linen shirt, unfastened at the neck and belted at the waist. His beige leggings were tucked into black leather boots. His jaw-length hair had been combed, his beard neatly trimmed, and he wore some type of musky scent that Equestria found to her liking. Placing a finger to her lips, she moved to the side of the doorway so Pantheus could see past her. Unintentionally holding his breath, he peered into the room, discovering Kessa sound asleep. His eyes softened and lingered a moment longer than he'd intended. Not even realizing he'd been holding his breath, he inhaled and exhaled deeply. Satisfied he'd seen enough, Equestria silently pulled the door shut and smiled shrewdly at him. Color stained his cheeks, and a moment of awkward silence followed. Aggravated and embarrassed by the unintended display of emotion, Pantheus started down the hall, whispering, "I just came to check how the patient was. I see that her color is good, and my thorough, though distant, examination leads me to believe the swelling is going down. I'm glad she's getting some rest. No doubt she needs it." Nodding, Equestria ignored Pantheus's wordy explanation and glanced back toward the door, still worried she'd awakened her sister. "She certainly does. Since this whole thing started, she's been increasingly agitated, though she doesn't know it. I've seen her lie awake all night without a wink." "Which would mean that you've had some restless nights, too," Pantheus observed, concern evident in his tone. "Perhaps you should have a nap also." "No, that's all right. I suppose exhaustion is to be expected, given what we've gone through." Her smile was a little sad. "I just wish—" Her voice trailed off. She walked alongside him, wordlessly, until they reached the stairs. "Malleus will come for us soon." Pantheus cocked an eyebrow, but said nothing. Surprisingly, his silence had a soothing effect on Equestria, who suddenly felt an urge to communicate. His silent companionship relaxed and unwound her more than any request or comment he could have made. The training had triggered potent memories of Malleus, and despite everything, she found herself missing him horribly. I don't understand how he could do this to me, to us. How can he be so cold? I thought he loved me. Does he actually take delight in hunting me down, in causing me grief? They reached the library, a comfortable yet grand room with several bookshelves, countless books, 2 large windows, and a massive fireplace. A plain wool rug, flanked by 2 intricately carved wooden chairs, occupied the space in front of the hearth. An immense desk, the largest Equestria had ever seen, was positioned between a window and the bookshelves. It was buried beneath papers, 2 inkwells, a feathered quill, and numerous stacks of books. A couple of wooden benches were placed about the room, inviting any would-be readers. Above the fireplace was a magnificent portrait of a knight, probably one of Pantheus's ancestors. She'd never been in this library. As children, they'd been forbidden entry. It was just as well, since that desk looked as though at one time it might have held important papers of state, among other things, and the tomes surrounding them were downright daunting, even now. The children's library had provided them with all the intrigue, education, and entertainment they'd craved anyway. Taking a seat in one of the chairs, Equestria watched pensively as Pantheus prepared a fire, and, once it was roaring, seated himself in the chair opposite. If none of this had happened, would you be happy with your husband? You mean, was our marriage happy? Yes, it was. I would be. I saw a side of Malleus no one else did. I loved. The fire crackled loudly, enjoying the dry fuel. Pantheus stared into it with a darkening grimace, as he pretended not to notice heartache overwhelming her. They sat there for quite a while, like 2 stone statues, the firelight dancing in their eyes as silent tears streamed down Equestria's face. Eventually, basic necessity became evident. Pantheus's stomach growled. Twilight was visible through the windows, and the fire had dimmed somewhat, casting ominous shadows around the library. Equestria was the first to move, standing up and facing her companion. Forgive me, Pantheus. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable, and I certainly didn't expect to. Standing up also, Pantheus said gently, There is nothing to forgive, Equestria. You've been through an awful ordeal. He wanted to say something meaningful and eloquent, something to help her feel better, but couldn't put his feelings into words. Finally, he simply put his arms around her in a brotherly hug and soothingly stroked her back. I've been looking all over for you two. Releasing each other, they turned to behold Kessa's figure silhouetted in the doorway. You're awake? Equestria said. Obviously, came the rather snarky reply. I'm starving. Surely it's well past supper time. Pantheus walked directly toward Kessa, looking as if he was going to walk right past her, but then he stopped. He looked down on her petulantly, like a teacher eyeing a troublesome student. I'll check if Mirabelle has something prepared. Seizing his shirt sleeve, Kessa said uneasily, I appreciate it, Thais. Sorry, I don't mean to be a pain. You know how grumpy I get when I'm hungry. His expression softened. Let's get you fed, then. Without looking at her sister, Kessa followed him to the great hall and sat down at the table while he went off to speak with Mirabelle. Equestria took the chair beside her, putting a hand on her shoulder. How do you feel? Fine, Kessa snapped icily, shrugging away from her touch. Movement in the corner caught Kessa's eye. Rake, ignoring their presence, was sitting on the same stool as earlier, sharpening a dagger. Impressive muscles undulated with each swipe of his arm, and Kessa unconsciously licked her lips as she watched their effort. A tight-fitting, sleeveless cream-colored shirt accented his rich, tanned skin and his well-toned physique. His black hair was shaved short, and he wore a meticulously trimmed goatee. Kessa felt lightheaded as she realized how attractive he was. Bounding over to him, she ogled the dagger. That, she pointed at the shiny blade, its edges snaking in 3 well-crafted curves that ended in a dangerous point, is a thing of beauty. Dark avocado green eyes observed her impassively before returning to their task. You know daggers? They're my weapon of choice. A smirk crossed his lips as he held the dagger up in the air, admiring it. She is my life, and has saved mine on more than one occasion. I compare her to a woman. She is shapely, subtle, well-made, and destructive. Noting that Pantheus had returned and was sitting at the table, goblet in hand, watching them coolly, Kessa moved slightly closer to Rake and giggled. Is that meant to be a compliment or an insult to the fairer sex? Sheathing the weapon, Rake folded his arms. Take it how you will. Well, you must be a real master at handling her. I'd like to see you in action sometime. I'm certain I'd learn a thing or two. He nodded. Casting the slightest sideways glance at Pantheus, Kessa purred, So, Rake, are you as masterful at handling your women as you are your dagger? Kessa! Equestria blurted, shock and disapproval observable in her facial expression. Kessa felt her face flush with heat as anger and embarrassment swelled within. Sure, her question might have been a little suggestive and a bit impetuous, but flirtation wasn't taboo, and she wasn't a child. Why did her sister insist on treating her like one? It wasn't as if Equestria or Pantheus were so innocent. They'd just been discovered locked in an embrace, paying no heed to her marital status. This was the first time Kessa actually sympathized with Malleus. Rake deserted his stool, struggling to repress a smile. The question is, whether you could handle me, little one. He chuckled. With a nod at Pantheus, he exited the room. Kessa watched animatedly as he strode away, appreciating how fine he looked from behind, with an unabashed enthusiasm. Still feeling flushed, this added fervor was a little too warming. She fanned herself. With an infatuated sigh, she whirled toward the table and exclaimed, Methinks he is too hot to handle. Her companions sat in silence, unmoving as she sat back down. The tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Kessa felt a twinge in her stomach that twisted painfully when she noted Pantheus's subdued expression. Dinner was uncomfortable, with little dialogue aside from a handful of obligatory comments and pleasantries. After he finished eating, Pantheus said goodnight and excused himself. Absolutely fuming, Equestria avoided eye contact with her sister. She knew Kessa often behaved rashly, but shamelessly flirting with a man she barely knew, and with selfish, vengeful intentions to boot, was uncalled for. Kessa's behavior, she realized, was a direct result of jealousy. She'd taken the hug she'd witnessed in the library completely out of context, and had practically flung herself at Rake as a means of getting even. It was childish, unacceptable behavior that, if left unchecked, could end in severe consequences. But severe consequences were already in effect, weren't they? Kessa's obscure but devastating activities had stripped Equestria of her husband, her home, her career, and her freedom in one fell swoop. Right then and there, the facts materialized for her to see. How had she been so blind? She had lost everything, while Kessa had actually gained. Kessa hadn't a home to lose. Neither had she a career to give up. Not a legitimate career, at any rate. Although Kessa was being hunted, she was doing what she loved, roaming with a beloved sister she'd pretty much been estranged from. With Equestria's husband and career out of the picture, Kessa now had her sister entirely to herself. As Pantheus had been insinuating, Equestria had had the most to lose. Not long after they'd arrived in the capital, Kessa had changed, or so Equestria had thought. Their relationship had gone downhill, that much was certain. Equestria became progressively occupied with her career and with Malleus, further negating her rapport with Kessa. Time ebbed on, her sister becoming increasingly distant. Kessa's well-being was always on Equestria's mind, like an aching muscle needing a massage she just didn't have time for. After she married Malleus, her sister was all but out of the picture, particularly since Kessa and Malleus didn't get along. Kessa had always been a bit of a roamer, but after Equestria's marriage, her wanderings became habitual. She never bought a house or put down any roots. In fact, it occurred to Equestria that she really didn't know where her sister had spent most of her nights, or what she did during her days. Truth be told, this realization both alarmed and shamed her. Sure, Kessa frequently slept at the Fane household, but what of the many nights she didn't? Preoccupied with her own life, concern for her sister's occupations or activities was, at most, an afterthought. Between her marriage and career, her time was limited. But if she'd thought to question her sister's whereabouts and goings-on routinely, the consequences they now faced might have been averted. These thoughts naturally irked Equestria further. Evidently, she'd failed to teach her sister propriety, sound judgment, and true selflessness. Hopefully it wasn't too late. Perhaps Pantheus's harsh-handedness was the necessary approach after all. Suddenly, Equestria's stomach hollowed out. Malleus had known all of this, had seen things as Pantheus saw things, and had tried to warn her. Somehow she hadn't been receptive to the warnings, had turned a blind eye to both her husband's and Pantheus's observations, until now. Malleus was only trying to spare... No, he'd wanted her to turn Kessa in, to abandon her, to give her to that vile tyrant Cassius. No matter how selfish her sister was, she wouldn't do that. She'd made her bed, now she had to lie in it. Perhaps her decision to leave all she'd worked for behind stemmed from guilt for having put it all before her sister. But it was her decision, nonetheless, and she'd stick by it. Finishing up what little she had left on her plate, Equestria took a moment to give her sister a stern look ere following Pantheus's example and leaving the table. Scraping her chair backward, Kessa stood up and looked around at the big, empty room. She slammed the chair back against the table. Simmering frustration, resentment, and anxiety escalated within her, like lava bubbling to the top of a volcano. Every inch of her was on fire with various emotions, causing her entire body to tremble. Attempting to cool herself down, she took a couple of deep breaths, but ultimately decided fresh air and a walk around the grounds would help the most. The night air was crisp, smelling of wood smoke and dried leaves. The fall moon was a little less full than the previous night, but bright nonetheless. Gravel crunched beneath her feet as she made no effort at stealth. A shadowy figure stood against the wall, and Kessa, recognizing Rake, felt the urge to retreat like a frightened rabbit. It was too late, though. He'd spotted her. "I'm not running away," she explained quickly, lifting her arms to protect her head, only partially teasing. "What are you doing?" he inquired, a twinkle in his eye. "Just getting some air. By the way, I wanted to thank you for the wrap you made for my head. It helped a lot. It was very thoughtful of you." "I was merely doing as Pantheus asked. No one round here knows herbs better than him. After I conked you over the head, he spent the rest of the night caring for you. First, he treated your hand, and then went about preparing some complicated concoction to help your head. He soaked the wrap in it for a couple of hours. After you went to breakfast, he instructed me to strain it and rub it in one of his powders, one that would allegedly stop the fabric from irritating your skin. Then I gave it to you." "Oh," Kessa muttered, feeling acute guilt for her assumption that it had been Rake who'd helped ease her pain. "He must have used witch hazel. I smelt it immediately, though the smell wasn't as potent as usual. He likely combined some type of fragrance to diminish the scent a little."
"Who knows?"
He steadied her and added,
"I use his oil on my bruises and sore muscles. Extraordinary stuff, just on its own. Don't know why he went to so much trouble for your little bump."
Kessa replied, "Because if it weren't for him, I wouldn't have had." Slowing down, she enunciated deliberately, "such a little bump in the first place." Rake made no comment, though one eyebrow slanted a little. "Well, he did order you to stop me from escaping. If he hadn't, you wouldn't have hit me, and then there would have been no need of the wrap."
"Right. No wrap. Just a shallow grave, probably. Would have been less work for him."
Rolling her eyes, Kessa realized that Pantheus's window was just above. Ignoring the image of Pantheus in between sheets, and the ensuing shiver that coursed through her, she further inquired, "Guarding him tonight, are we?" Shrugging, Rake turned away.
"I guard everyone. Now go to bed, little girl."
Generally, being called little girl would have insulted Kessa, but it didn't bother her when Rake said it. In fact, she found herself liking it. She wondered if Pantheus was awake and could hear their conversation. Then a terrible thought crossed her mind. Equestria and Pantheus had left the table around the same time. Picturing their previous embrace, she wondered if they'd arranged to meet up later so they could continue what she'd interrupted. A vision of Pantheus and her sister enjoying each other's passion entered her mind. It was difficult to erase, even when she shook her head violently. Red heat flushed her cheeks, her stomach felt queasy, and there was a deep ache she couldn't explain when she thought of Pantheus and Equestria together. "Perhaps you'd like some company," she offered dulcetly, skipping up to Rake, who'd started patrolling. She'd take anything, any company that would help rid her mind of flashes of what Equestria and Pantheus could be up to. He snorted,
"No."
"Maybe you spend your nights guarding others because you have trouble sleeping alone." Rake stopped, turning to face her. His eyes flashed.
"Be careful of playing with the bull, little girl. You might get the horn."
Looking up, he gestured behind her.
"Your sister is coming."
Kessa turned around to perceive her sister, hurrying toward her as a mother hen might pursue her wayward chicks. Turning around again, Kessa opened her mouth to speak, but Rake had gone too far ahead. "Kessa, what are you—" Kicking at the dirt, Kessa snapped, "Leave me be, sis. I don't want a lecture." Heading for her room, Kessa acknowledged, with a sense of relief, that Equestria was not with Pantheus. She felt better until she realized that her sister must have overheard her dialogue with Rake from Pantheus's window and ran down to get her. Reaching the bower, Kessa tried to slam the door, but Equestria blocked it and entered behind her. After her thoughts at dinner, Equestria had decided she wanted to have a gentle heart-to-heart with Kessa, but given her sister's surly attitude, she figured that wasn't likely to happen. It was more likely to be a skirmish than a heart-to-heart. "Kessa, what's wrong?" she demanded. "Nothing." "Something." "Did you have a good day with Pantheus? Getting along well, are you?" Kessa blurted, unable to bottle it in, regardless of her efforts. "Is he helping you forget your treacherous husband?" She spewed the word husband with considerable venom. Equestria looked grim, retorting, "I'm not even going to dignify that with an answer." "Of course not. You can't deny the truth. You're a married woman. The circumstances of your marriage aside, you should not be engaging in—" Kessa neglected saying any word that had to do with romance. "With another man." Sighing heavily, Equestria sat at the foot of the bed, bending down to remove her boots, as her sister stomped around the room, throwing clothing, picking it up only to fling it away again, too frustrated to actually prepare for bed. This was not the first time Equestria had seen Kessa this worked up. She knew she would not stop and would not listen. She would, however, be certain to cover every single tiny event that had annoyed her in the past 10 years. Replying, arguing, agreeing, or soothing were all pointless. It was best just to let her blow off some steam and speak with her later. Fatigued, Equestria climbed into bed while Kessa ravaged the room in a temper. Equestria had thought to warn her that this tirade would only result in a blistering headache the next day, but decided her warnings would go unheeded anyway. Saying goodnight quietly, not really intending to be heard, she closed her eyes and, despite the racket, was soon asleep. Opening her sleepy eyes, Kessa noted two things. One, Equestria was gone, and two, there was a pretty white dove singing sweetly on her windowsill. She sat up, cringing as her head protested. Last night's tantrum, which she regretted now, not just because of her headache, had exhausted her, and she'd overslept. Getting out of bed, she walked over to the washstand, sighing as the dove, startled by her movements, flew away. In the mirror, she was amazed to find that the bump on her head had practically vanished, but was dismayed to see puffy purplish bags under her eyes instead. Rinsing her face, Kessa overheard someone exercising outside and immediately concluded that Equestria and Pantheus were sparring again. They'd probably enjoyed the morning together, without her. Going over to the window, she popped her head out and looked down at the training yard. A slight smile curved her lips, despite herself, and her body tingled with heat when she beheld Pantheus, his shirt tossed aside, muscles gleaming in the uncharacteristically warm fall sunshine, punching a dummy. His punches were precise and power-packed. Every inch of his body was sculpted and firm, denoting the many hours he dedicated to physical fitness. He was alone, and his concentration was intense, flawless. At that moment, Kessa wished she was that dummy, taking in every expertly executed punch, feeling his power, his exertion. And particularly, she wished to feel the strength of his arms when he wrapped them around the dummy's neck for a breather. But then, thinking of her current headache and the shape, or misshape, of the dummy overall, she thought better of it. True, she enjoyed sparring, but it certainly wouldn't do to play the part of a dummy. Bending to pick up a towel, Pantheus dabbed his face, sopping up the sweat Kessa imagined was trickling down his forehead, his neck, his muscular chest. She jumped away from the window, startled by the realization that she'd been daydreaming about his sweat for too long, and he'd noticed her. He'd watched her watch him. She blushed. Mortified at being caught, she looked around the room to see if she was still alone. Nice view, huh? Equestria smirked, leaning against the door frame, her arms crossed. Kessa cursed Equestria's stealth, wondering how long she'd been there. It's a lovely day. Despite Kessa's deflection, Equestria knew it was not the beauty of the day that her sister had been admiring. Get dressed, Kessa. I asked Mirabelle to keep breakfast warm for you. Thanks, Equestria. Kessa was about to apologize for last night when she remembered the embrace she'd walked in on. Closing her mouth firmly, she hurried to change her clothes and squeezed past her sister through the door. Aware her older sister was tailing her, Kessa hurried down the hallway toward the great room. She rounded a corner sharply, bumping straight into Pantheus. Quickly recovering from the collision, Pantheus stared at her silently, and she bowed her head in a mute greeting. Pantheus carried his shirt in one hand and had flung a towel over his left shoulder. His muscles were even more pronounced now that he was standing right in front of her. Working hard to avert her eyes from his very attractive and well-tanned chest, Kessa attempted to slide by him. But then he spoke. Ah, Equestria, I just ran into Mirabelle and was inquiring after you two. The enthusiasm in his voice, the way he lit up when he saw her sister, and how he'd pointedly ignored her, even though he'd seen her first, stung Kessa like a bee. Actually, it was more like an entire colony of bees. She felt like that 6-year-old girl who'd pushed him in the river. He'd ignored her then, too. But what had she done this time? How's your head this morning, Kessie? He practically growled, and his pet name for her sounded more than a little derisive. Her blue eyes rose from his incredible pectorals to his baby blues. Having never noticed how vibrantly blue they were before, she marveled at their stunning clarity. Come to think of it, she'd never really studied him, never noticed how handsome his features were, and never appreciated his dark blonde hair and well-trimmed beard. Right then and there, it struck Kessa that her Theis was a grown man, and an extremely attractive one at that. Why wasn't he married? He was in his early 20s, handsome, a lord, and wealthy, even in these destitute times. Certainly he must have had many women wanting to be his bride. Brow furrowing, she remembered he'd asked her a question. What had he asked her again? My head feels much better, thanks to you. Her words were hesitant and very pronounced. Shame at having assumed that Rake was the one to thank for the rap still needled her. Oh, he replied quickly. I thought if it wasn't for me, you wouldn't have a bump in the first place. Wincing under his unexpected acerbic tone, Kessa inwardly acknowledged that Pantheus either overheard last night's discussion with Rake or had been told about it. She saw Equestria's hand touch his arm gently, and a sudden anger seared her. She began mentally processing the way he'd treated her since her arrival, the way he'd lectured her, ostracized her, and had just spoken to her. The frequent, disturbing flashes of the encounter in the library, and Kessa's own imaginings of Theis and Equestria in various intensities of affection, added fuel to the fire. It's true, she snarled, but I no longer regret it, Theis. She used the same contempt for his pet name as he had for hers. I'd take a bump on the head to meet a man like Rake any day. Seeing his lips tighten and his fists clench, she added, I'm glad he whacked some sense into me, and I hope we get to discuss just how glad I am in a more private setting soon. Disregarding Equestria's protest, she spun on her heels and veered toward the smell of delicious food, calling back, "Now, if you two lovebirds'll excuse me, I'm starving." Kessa lay slumped on the table, an empty bowl and an open book next to her, both disregarded. Having finished eating over half an hour ago, she was bored and more than a little restless. Her mind was too preoccupied with her troubles to concentrate on reading. The way she'd spoken to Pantheus upset her now, although at the time she was aiming to absolutely eviscerate him. No one, not even Mirabel, had disturbed her, and she didn't want to think about why. She considered looking for her sister and Pantheus, but decided against it. She didn't want to discover them in the act of anything more intense than an embrace. That had hurt enough. Ultimately, she opted to go for a run around the grounds. Running was always a good thing to do when she had a lot on her mind, or needed to blow off steam.